my nephew was full of panic and a strange bite mark on his skin. But the nightmare was just beginning when I discovered the horrifying truth about my daughter-in-law. The crunch of gravel pulled Ellie out of her reverie, her eyes shifting from the barn to the sleek black car slowly pulling up. A boy stepped out. Jerry, her nephew, whom she hadn't seen since he was cradled in her arms. His oversized coat swallowed him up. Her son, Thomas, and his new wife, Sarah, had sent Jerry to her for 3 months while they worked overseas. "Welcome, kid," she called from the porch, her voice hoarse. She tried to make it sound warm. Jerry didn't look up. He tightened his grip around the duffel bag and stared at the ground. The car's engine sped up and it pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust that lingered longer than it should have. Ellie squinted, her silver hair catching the weak sunlight, and muttered, "I guess so." "Come in," she said, turning toward the door, tapping slowly on the old boards. Jerry followed, his steps hesitant, and she felt the weight of his silence pressing against her back. Inside, the farmhouse creaked with every movement, the air thick with wood smoke and the faint musk of old leather. She pointed toward the stairs, her arms stiff with the morning chill. "Your room is up there, first on the right. Bed made." He nodded, or she thought he nodded, and drifted instead to the window, his breath fogging the glass in shallow puffs. Beyond the glass, the forest appeared, its edges blurred by late autumn mist. Ellie watched him for a moment, her brow furrowed, then limped into the kitchen, thinking he would find his way when he was ready. "Are you hungry?" she called over her shoulder, grabbing a frying pan from the rack. The metal clanged, but there was no answer. She sighed, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter, and decided to leave it as is. The barn felt like a haven afterward, its walls saturated with the familiar scent of hay and horses. Ellie combed through Daisy's grey fur, her hands steady despite the pain in her legs, an old wound from a failed parachute drop decades ago. The horse snorted softly, leaning toward her, and Ellie whispered, "You're still a good girl, aren't you?" A shadow moved in the doorway, and she glanced up at Jerry, his face half hidden in the dim light. He was quiet, too quiet, his hands deep in his pockets. She nodded at him, an unspoken invitation, but he didn't move closer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, though all she heard was a faint whisper carried by the cold air. "Have you ever met Daisy?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes on the horse. "He's been with me longer than most, flying with me in a way, back when I was hauling stuff over the mountains." Jerry's eyes flicked to Daisy, then back to the floor. He didn't answer, and Ellie let the silence drag on, the brush running through Daisy's mane in long, deliberate strokes. She wondered what Thomas had said to him, or not said, before sending him here. Her son's voice still rang in her ears from their last call. "Just 3 more months, Mum. We'll be back from the rink before you know it." Not to mention Jerry's grimace, or the way he acted as if he were waiting for something to break. "You don't have to say it," she said finally, setting the brush down. "But you're here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She straightened, her sore legs protesting, and looked him in the eye for the first time. Eyes wide, dark and searching, but he was gone quickly back to the barn door, back to whatever he'd left behind. She left him there, her stick pounding the ground as she headed home. The day was turning to dusk, the fog thickening outside, and Ellie found herself in the kitchen again, the warmth of the oven seeping into her bones. She took a pan of cornbread from the rack, the edges golden and crisp, and cut a square, watching the steam curl in the dim light. It wasn't much, but there was something. Her mother's recipe, the one she'd made for Thomas when he was a kid, before he'd traded the family home for the boardroom. "You eat when you want," she muttered to the empty room, knowing he wouldn't hear her. She carried the plate upstairs, her steps slow and measured, and set it outside his door, the faint clink of pottery against wood louder than it should have been. Downstairs, she sank into an armchair by the fireplace, the sound of wood creaking and filling the space where words could not. 3 months, she told herself, her fingers tracing the old fabric of the armrest. She thought of Thomas, his broken voice on the phone, and Sarah, the woman he'd been watching from the corner of the pictures he'd sent. Then Jerry, a boy she barely knew, had come into her life like a stone dropped into still water. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and listened to the house settle around her. Upstairs, Jerry sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under his light weight. The tortillas were still there, the warmth fading, and he stared at the window again, the darkness of the woods against the glass. His fingers twitched in his thighs, and he whispered something, soft, broken, to no one but himself. Ellie couldn't hear it, but the weight of it hung in the air, a thread she would have to untangle, one slow knot at a time. Mist clung to the grass, softening the world to a hazy watercolor. Ellie woke to the groan of her joints, the familiar protest of a body that had endured too many years and too few apologies. She pulled on her boots, leather wrinkled and worn, and stepped outside where the air bit at her knuckles. Jerry was there, perched on a fence post like a bird that had forgotten how to fly, his lean frame swallowed up by that oversized coat. His fingers danced nervously, tracing shapes she couldn't decipher, and his eyes remained locked on the woods, where the trees stood like sentinels in the mist. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and hoarse. He didn't turn, but his shoulders stiffened. She limped toward the stables, her cane sinking into the damp earth, and took Daisy's saddle, the weight of it pulling at her sore leg. The horse grazed nearby, her grey coat catching the soft orange light of dawn, and Ellie felt a warm feeling, something solid, in her chest. "Ever ridden?" she asked, setting the saddle on the fence and glancing at Jerry. Her voice was soft but firm, the way she spoke to new recruits who didn't know who was up next. He shook his head, quick and sharp, his eyes flicking to Daisy, then back to the trees, as if he were watching something she couldn't see. "I guess so," she muttered, more to herself than to him, and began to saddle Daisy, her hands moving slowly and surely over the leather straps. "She's been with me a long time, she. When I was flying, well, not flying her, but you know what I mean. We loaded the chopper, she in the trailer, me in the cockpit, and we were off, through storms and worse." Jerry's lips parted just a little, and she caught it out of the corner of her eye. He was watching, his fingers pausing for a moment, though he didn't say a word. She tightened her grip on the reins, her breath coming out white in the cold, and continued, her voice as steady as the rhythm of her hands. "One time, we hit such turbulence that I thought we'd hit the ground. Daisy, though, never flinched. Just stood there, rock solid, while the rest of us clung on for dear life." She stepped back, rubbing her palms against her jeans and holding out the reins. In the end, the bus... "Your turn," she said, nodding toward the horse. Jerry hesitated, his sneakers scraping the dirt, and she wondered if he would run home, but he moved, slowly and stiffly, mounting Daisy as if he feared she would shatter beneath his feet. The horse snorted, a slight puff of air, and he tightened his grip, his knuckles white on his skin. Ellie walked beside them, her stick leaving small indentations in the ground, and she was silent for once. Daisy's hooves clicked softly, a contrast to the stillness of the morning, and Jerry swayed with her steps, his eyes still glancing occasionally toward the woods. She wanted to ask him what he was looking for, what was making him so tense, but the words stuck in her throat, heavy and unspoken. "I'm fine," she said instead, her tone softer than she'd intended. He didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed a little, and she counted that as a victory. They circled the field once, twice, the mist thinning as the sun rose higher, and she felt the ache in her legs deepen, a slow pulse she had learned to live with. "Enough," she called, leading Daisy back to the fence. Jerry slid off, shy but careful, and handed her the reins without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," he muttered, so quietly she barely heard him, and then he was gone, shuffling toward the house with his hands back in his pockets. She watched him go, her brow furrowed, and led Daisy to the stables, her mind replaying that single word, "Thank you," as if it were a clue to something bigger. The day passed slowly and normally, filled with the chores she did out of habit, stacking firewood, checking the well pump, boiling water for tea. Jerry stayed upstairs, the occasional creak of the floorboards announcing his presence, and she left him there, thinking he would come down when he was ready. The night fell heavily, the fog hanging like a shroud around the farmhouse. Ellie was dozing in the armchair, the fire burning in the grate, when a sound woke her. Faint footsteps moving outside, deliberate and uneven. She pushed herself up, her stick thumping against the floor, and looked out the window, the glass cold in her palm. Jerry's figure flickered in the yard, a ghost in the darkness, and then he was gone, slipping into the barn as if chasing something, or running from it. "What are you doing, kid?" she said, her breath fogging the window. She grabbed her coat, but something stopped her, an intuition she hadn't had since the war when she'd learned to trust in the calm before the storm. "I'm here now," she said to the empty yard, her voice a whisper, echoing her words from the barn. She turned back inside, the firelight drawing her in, and sank back into the chair, eyes on the window. Whatever was haunting him, she thought, it wasn't something she could force out, not yet. Upstairs, Jerry's door was still closed, the cornbread long gone cold. In the barn, Daisy shifted, her ears to the darkness, and the woods beyond held their secrets, waiting. An owl somewhere deep in the woods, its call cutting through the night like a needle pulling at stitches. The farm was silent, and Ellie woke with a start, her breath coming in short gasps as Daisy's incessant whinnying pierced the silence, sharp and urgent. She fumbled for the flashlight on the nightstand, her fingers stiff with sleep, and swung her legs across the bed, wincing as her sore leg protested the sudden movement. The beam shook in her hand as she hobbled down the stairs, forgetting her cane in her haste, and she pushed open the back door, the cold biting at her bare arms. The barn came into view, its cracked boards glowing faintly in the moonlight, and she quickened her pace, Daisy's restless sounds pulling her forward. Inside, the air smelled of hay and damp wood, and she found Jerry curled against Daisy's hip, his knees drawn tight to his chest. His coat was tight around him, a shield ill-fitting, and the horse's ears twitched nervously, her breath white in the dim light. Ellie knelt beside him, her legs screeching as she lowered herself, and she held the flashlight tight, its light catching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His eyes flicked into the darkness, quick and wild, like a cornered animal tracking a threat. "What's got you scared, kid?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp, the tone she used to draw answers from soldiers too shaken to speak. Jerry shifted, his arms tightening around his knees, and muttered, "They're after me," his words so faint they were almost lost in the rustling of the hay. "Who are they?" she pressed, leaning closer, her warm breath fighting the cold. He didn't answer, just stared past her, his gaze focused on the dark corners where the moonlight didn't reach. She swept the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, seeing nothing but cobwebs swaying in the wind and dust motes drifting like stray stars. "There's no one here but us and Daisy," she said, sitting down beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she stepped lightly onto the straw-covered floor. He didn't move, didn't speak, and she let the silence stretch, long and heavy, her presence a quiet anchor in the unsteady night. Daisy shifted, her warm hips against them, and Ellie put a hand on the horse's hip, feeling her steady breathing. "I used to sit like this with her," she said after a moment, her voice low and even, "back when the nights got loud. Bombs, engine, machine sound. She would keep me grounded, even if the ground wasn't there." Jerry's head tilted, his eyes still staring into the darkness, but she caught a glimmer of it. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. "You don't have to tell me now," she added, her voice softening, "but I'm not leaving you here alone, you hear me?" He nodded, tilting his chin slightly, and she took that as enough, her gaze drifting toward the barn door, half expecting something to sneak by. The hours passed, the moonlight shifting across the floor, and Ellie's legs cramped from sitting so long, though she didn't move. Jerry's breathing slowed, his shoulders relaxed a little, and she decided it was time to call Thomas to get this over with. She limped back into the house, flashlight flickering with each step, and dialed his number, the old rotary phone cold against her ear. His voice was hoarse, broken, and disdainfully. "He's fine, Mum. It's just a child's imagination." "Not like this," she snapped, her hand gripping the receiver, her jaw clenched as he spoke. "He's scared, Thomas. So scared he hides in his cage at night." "Children are scared," he said, his voice flat as if he were reading from a script. "You're making it bigger than it is. We have enough to do here." The line went dead, a sharp click echoing in the silence, and Ellie stared at the phone, her knuckles white as she fought the urge to call back and scream. "He's your son," she muttered to the empty kitchen, her voice hoarse with frustration, and put the receiver down, her hands shaking slightly. She grabbed an old blanket from the couch, the edges frayed from years of use, and headed back into the barn, the night air fresher. Jerry was still there, his head against Daisy's hip, and she draped the blanket over his shoulders, the fabric soft and heavy. The horse nuzzled him, a gentle nudge, and Ellie watched for a moment, her chest tightening at the sight. "Sleep if you can," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and straightened, her leg throbbing as she moved to the door. "I'll be inside. The door's open if you need me." He didn't answer, but his fingers he rolled into the blanket, pulling it closer, and she stepped into the yard, the moonlight tinting her silver hair. Back at the house, she sank into anxiety, and she wondered what he hadn't said, what he'd buried beneath that cool calm. She thought of Jerry, small and haunted, and Daisy, steady as ever, and felt a stability settle in her bones, quiet but solid. In the barn, Jerry clutched the blanket, his breathing even, and Daisy stood watch, her ears still twitching toward the darkness. Outside, the woods hummed with secrets, the fog curling tighter, waiting for dawn to break it. The damp woods made a mist around the farmhouse. Ellie stood by the stove, the sizzling of eggs, the kitchen a warm, familiar hum, and her sore feet found their footing for the first time in the stillness of the morning. Jerry shuffled in, his sneakers dragging on the floor, and she glanced up, saw his shirt slip off one shoulder, revealing a patch of skin that made her shiver. A mark, red and jagged, puckered like a bite, stared at her, and the spoon slipped from her hand, hitting the tile with a sound that cut through the air. "What was that?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice sharp and urgent, the kind she used when a mission had gone awry. Jerry yanked his shirt up, his face pale, and rushed to the door, his steps quick and uneven. She grabbed the stick, the wood clicking against the porch steps as she followed, and Daisy ran after her, her grey hair swaying in the clear light. "Jerry, stop!" she called, her breath white in the cold, but he had disappeared into the yard, his coat flapping like a flag of surrender. She moved faster than she should, her legs protesting at every step, and found him at the edge of the woods, crouching under a towering pine, the mist swirling around him like a living thing. His hand was clutching something small and shiny, a necklace, a silver S dangling from a thin chain, and his fingers were shaking, white and unsteady. "Hey," she said, more gently now, kneeling beside him despite her aching knees, her stick sinking into the pine needles. "Look at me, kid." His eyes met hers, wide and raw, terror shimmering there like water about to spill, and she reached out, slowly and carefully, tilting his chin to get a better look at the bite. It wasn't bear, not wolf, not even snake. Too deliberate, too strange, like something had been carved into him on purpose. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice even but laced with a tremor she couldn't hide, her thumb brushing the edge of his shirt. He pulled away, the necklace slipping from his hand and dangling between them, and muttered, "I don't know," barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "You don't know? Or don't want to tell?" she pressed, her gaze locked on his, searching for the truth he was burying. He shook his head, fast and frantic, and she sighed, her breath starting to fog, her mind drifting back to Thomas's refusal on the phone. Just a child's imagination, and how it hadn't been right then, and it wasn't right now. "Something's wrong," she said, more to herself than to him, and shifted her weight, studying the wound again, the way it creased his pale skin. "I've seen wounds. Bullet wounds, shrapnel, dog bites in basic training, and this isn't any of them." She leaned closer, her silver hair brushing her cheek, and added, "You're not running away from nowhere, are you?" Jerry gripped the necklace tighter, his lips pressed into a thin line, and she noticed how he stared at the trees, following the shadows she couldn't see. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft, her hand on his arm, firm but gentle. "You don't have to tell me now, but I'm not going to let this go." Daisy snorted behind them, her ears cocked forward, and Ellie glanced back, her brow furrowed as the horse shifted uncomfortably. "What's got you so upset, girl?" she whispered, standing up, her cane steadying her as she swept away the fog. Jerry scrambled up too, his breath coming in short gasps, and then Daisy reared, her hooves hitting the ground with a force that shook Ellie's bones, her neigh sharp and wild. "Easy!" Ellie snapped, grabbing the reins, her heart pounding as she pulled Daisy closer, the horse's flanks shaking under her hands. She turned to Jerry, her voice low and urgent. "What do you see out there?" He shook his head, but his eyes remained fixed on the mist, wide and unblinking, and she felt a chill run down her spine, one she hadn't felt since a night patrol gone wrong years ago. "Come on," she said, tugging at Daisy's reins, her stick digging into the ground as she started back toward the house. "We're not standing around waiting for trouble." Jerry followed, his steps close and quick, the necklace still clutched in his hand. And she kept her footing, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet form. Back in the kitchen, the eggs were cooling in the pan, the sizzling sound long gone. Ellie's hands were shaking as she poured water into the kettle. "Sit down," she said. He didn't answer, just stared at the table, and she added, "I'm serious, kid. I've fought worse than the dark." The kettle buzzed, a shrill clang that filled the silence, and Ellie poured 2 cups of tea, pushing one toward him, her fingers brushing against the chipped china. She sat across from him, her legs stiff and sore, and looked at him, the silence stretching between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Outside, the fog was thick, the woods swallowing the light, and Daisy stood by the barn, her ears still pricked at the unseen. A pair of crows huddles under the eaves, their feathers ruffled as rain lashes the farmhouse in steady sheets. The wind moans through the trees, bending branches into fleeting, shadowed shapes. Ellie ushers Jerry into her study, the door creaking as it swings open, and she nudges him toward a chair, its leather worn soft by years of restless nights. Rain drums against the windows, a relentless tattoo that fills the cluttered room. Old maps pinned to the walls, military medals glinting in a dusty case. A faded photo of her in flight gear tacked above the desk. She sets a mug of cocoa between his hands, the steam curling upward in delicate wisps, and leans forward, her cane propped against the armrest, her voice steady despite the storm outside. "Talk to me, kid," she says, her eyes locking onto his, firm but not unkind. "No more hiding. We're past that now." Jerry stares into the mug, his fingers tightening around it, and she waits, her breath slow and even, giving him space to find the words. "It's Sarah," he whispers finally, his voice halting, barely rising above the rain's rhythm. She's not what she seems." He pauses, his lips trembling, and Ellie leans closer, her silver hair catching the dim lamplight, her heart thudding as he pushes on. "She's got this place, a lab, underground somewhere. Cold smile, always watching, and she stuck me with a needle once. Said it'd make me better." "Better how?" Ellie asks, her tone sharp but controlled, her hands tightening on her cane until the wood creaks. Jerry flinches, his eyes flicking to the window where rain streaks the glass, and mumbles, "Didn't feel better. Then something bit me. Something she made. Something wrong." His words paint a picture, fractured and chilling, of a woman who bred monsters, of a mark that wasn't an accident. Ellie's mind races, flashing back to war zones, smoke and chaos, threats she could shoot or outrun, and she reaches out, pulling the necklace from his grip, its silver S cool against her calloused fingers. She turns it over, feeling its weight, and mutters, "This hers?" Jerry nods, a quick jerk of his head, and she studies it, her jaw tightening as she pieces together the mark, the fear, the way he scans the dark like it's alive. "What kind of something?" she presses, her voice low and steady, her thumb brushing the engraved letter. He shrugs, his shoulders hunching, and says, "Big, fast, not normal." The rain intensifies outside, a low rumble of thunder rolling through, and he flinches again, his mug trembling in his hands, cocoa sloshing against the rim. "Hey," she says, resting a hand on his shoulder, firm and grounding, her touch cutting through the storm's growl. "You're here, not there. Whatever she did, it's not touching you now." His eyes meet hers, wide and searching, and she adds, "I've fought worse than lab tricks, seen things that'd make your hair curl. We'll figure this out." He doesn't answer, just stares at the necklace in her hand, and she feels the weight of his silence, heavy as the rain-soaked air. "You believe me?" he asks after a moment, his voice small, testing, like he's afraid she'll laugh or turn away. She nods, slow and deliberate, and says, "Yeah, I do. Seen too much in my time to call you a liar." The thunder rumbles again, softer now, and Ellie leans back, her mind churning with Sarah's cold smile. Thomas's wife, the woman she's only met through clipped phone calls and glossy photos. "Your dad know about this?" she asks, her tone careful, probing the edges of something she's not sure she wants to uncover. Jerry's gaze drops, his fingers tracing the mug's handle, and he mutters, "Maybe." He didn't stop her. "Didn't stop her," she echoes, her voice hardening, her chest tightening as she thinks of Thomas's dismissive, "He's fine," from the night before. She sets the necklace on the desk, its chain pooling like a snake, and stands, her legs stiff but steady, her resolve clicking into place like a loaded clip. "That's not good enough," she says, more to herself than to him, and moves to the phone, its rotary dial cold under her fingers. "Who are you calling?" Jerry asks, his voice lifting slightly, curiosity edging out the fear. She glances back, her expression set, and says, "Old friend, someone who digs where I can't." She dials Rachel Kane, a name from her past, a woman who tracked secrets when Ellie tracked targets, and waits as the line crackles, the rain a steady drumbeat behind her. "Ellie," Rachel's voice comes through, rough with sleep but warm, and Ellie grips the receiver, her tone low and urgent. "I need your help, Reg. Something's not right. Real not right." She glances at Jerry, his mug still cradled close, and adds, "Got a kid here with a story that's making my skin crawl. Can you look into someone for me?" "Always," Rachel says, the warmth sharpening into focus, and Ellie exhales, her shoulders easing a fraction. "Name's Sarah, married to my son, Thomas. Runs some kind of lab, maybe worse. I'll fill you in when you're awake." The line hums and Rachel grunts. "Give me a day. You okay?" "Been better," Ellie admits, her eyes on Jerry, his gaze fixed on the window again, tracking the storm. "But I'll manage." She hangs up, the click loud in the quiet, and turns back to him, her voice softening as she says, "You're not alone in this, hear me?" Jerry nods, slow and tentative, and she sits again, the chair creaking under her, her hand resting near his on the desk. The rain slows to a drizzle, the thunder fading into memory, and she watches him, the silence between them thick with unspoken promises, fragile but growing. Outside, the forest drinks in the storm, its shadows deepening, and the necklace glints on the desk, a quiet threat waiting to be faced. A fox slinks through the underbrush, its eyes glinting as rain drips from the canopy, pooling in the hollows of the forest floor. The air hums with the scent of wet pine and the faint tang of smoke. Ellie moves through the woods surrounding the farm, her hands steady as she rigs traps. Tripwires strung with bells, smoke canisters tucked into roots, her movements deliberate, though her limp slows her. A stubborn ache she pushes through. Jerry watches from the porch, his thin frame hunched against the rail, Daisy's reins clutched in his hands, the horse's grey coat slick with drizzle. She glances back now and then, catching his eyes, wide and watchful, and nods, a silent promise she's still here, still fighting. "Used to set these in the field," she calls over her shoulder, tying a wire taut between two trees, her voice rough but steady. "Kept the enemy guessing, gave us time to breathe." Jerry shifts, his sneakers scuffing the wood, and asks, "Did it work?" She pauses, her fingers brushing the rusted bell, and says, "Most times." "Enough to get us through." He doesn't reply, just tightens his grip on the reins, and she keeps working, her cane propped against a trunk, her mind ticking through Sarah's shadow, labs, needles, monsters, and the tracker she hasn't found yet. The day fades into dusk, the rain easing to a fine mist, and Ellie limps back to the yard, her boots sinking into the mud. She lights a fire, the flames crackling to life, casting long shadows that dance across the grass, and beckons Jerry over, her hand outstretched. "Here," she says, handing him a stick, thick and sturdy, her fingers guiding his as she shows him how to sharpen it with her pocket knife. "Hold it firm, angle it like this." He follows, his movements clumsy but earnest, and she watches, her eyes fierce, the firelight carving lines into her weathered face. "You're not alone in this," she adds, her voice low and unyielding. "Not while I'm standing." "Think they'll come?" he asks, his hands pausing, the stick half-pointed, his gaze flicking to the woods where the trees loom dense and dripping. She shrugs, her jaw tightening, and says, "Maybe. Doesn't matter. They'll trip over me first." He nods, slow and tentative, and resumes sharpening, the scrape of the blade a quiet rhythm against the fire's hiss. A bell jingles in the distance, faint but clear, and Ellie's head snaps up, her hand dropping to the shotgun propped beside her. "Behind me!" she says, sharp and urgent, motioning Jerry back as she rises, the fire's glow flickering in her silver hair. He scrambles to obey, his stick clutched like a lifeline, and they creep into the woods, her cane traded for the gun, its weight familiar in her grip. She triggers a canister, smoke billowing out in thick curls, and catches a glint of movement. A massive, skittering shape, too fast, too wrong, vanishing into the mist before she can aim. "What was that?" Jerry whispers, his voice trembling, his breath warm against her shoulder as they crouch behind a pine. She squints into the haze, her heart thudding, and mutters, "Don't know yet, but it's not staying." The smoke clears, leaving only silence, and she straightens, her bad leg stiff but steady, her shotgun still raised. "Come on," she says, turning back. "We're not chasing ghosts tonight." They trudge to the house, the fire smoldering behind them, and Ellie locks the door, her fingers lingering on the bolt, her mind replaying that glint. Too deliberate, too alive. She sets the gun by the kitchen table and pulls the necklace from her pocket, its silver S catching the light, and studies it, her brow furrowing as she notices a faint red blink, tiny and pulsing, embedded in the clasp. "You see this?" she asks, holding it up, her voice tight with realization. Jerry leans closer, his eyes widening, and says, That's hers? She always knew where I was." Ellie's breath sharpens, her boot grinding into the floor as she crushes the tracker beneath it, the crunch loud in the quiet, the red light snuffing out. "Not anymore," she says, her tone hard, her hands trembling slightly as she sweeps the pieces into her palm. "She's still out there," Jerry murmurs, his voice small, his fingers tracing the table's grain, and Ellie nods, dumping the shards into the trash, her jaw clenching as she thinks of Thomas, of Sarah, of secrets piling up like storm clouds. "Yeah, she is," she says, sitting across from him, her elbows resting heavy on the wood. "But so are we, and I've got a few tricks left." "You sure?" he asks, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of hope edging out the fear, and she meets his gaze, steady and fierce. "Damn sure. I didn't haul Daisy through hell just to lose now." He exhales, a shaky breath, and she adds, "Rachel's digging. Give her time, she'll turn something up." The wind howls outside, rattling the windows, and Daisy stamps nervously by the barn, her hooves thudding against the earth, an eerie clicking sound drifting from the trees. "That's them, isn't it?" Jerry says, his voice dropping, his hands curling into fists, and Ellie leans forward, her tone softening but firm. "Maybe. Doesn't change a thing. You're here, I'm here, and they're not getting through." He nods, slow and uncertain, and she rises, her leg aching as she moves to the sink, filling a glass with water, her mind churning with the day's weight. Traps. Smoke. That shape in the mist. "Sleep if you can," she says over her shoulder, setting the glass beside him. "I'll keep watch." He doesn't reply, just stares at the water, and she settles into her chair, the shotgun close, the night pressing in. Outside, the forest holds its breath, the rain a faint whisper, and the shadows stretch long and quiet, waiting for the next move. A bat flutters against the barn's roof, its wings brushing the weathered wood as a moonless sky presses down, thick and unyielding. The wind carries a faint, unnatural clicking, sharp against the night's hush. Ellie snaps awake, her heart lurching as Daisy's panicked cries slice through the farmhouse, high and desperate. She grabs the lantern from the bedside, its handle cold in her grip, and races down the stairs, her bad leg throbbing with every step, Jerry's footsteps pounding close behind. The barn door bangs open under her push, the lantern swinging wild in her hand, casting jagged shadows across the straw, and she freezes, her breath catching at the sight. A hulking spider, legs like daggers, looms over Daisy, its mandibles clicking, a sound that grates against her bones. "Back!" she barks, shoving Jerry behind her, her voice sharp and commanding, her free hand raising the shotgun she snatched from the kitchen. He stumbles, his sneakers slipping on the dirt, and she steadies her aim, the barrel glinting in the flickering light. "Stay there," she adds, her tone hard, her eyes locked on the creature as it turns, its too many eyes glinting like wet coal. "What is it?" Jerry gasps, his voice tight, his hands clutching the barn wall, and she fires, the blast echoing through the rafters, a deafening roar that makes Daisy rear. The spider skitters aside, faster than it should, and lunges at her, its legs slashing the air. Ellie rolls, her bad legs screaming as she hits the ground, straw digging into her palms, and she grabs a pitchfork propped nearby, jabbing at its eyes with a grunt, her arms straining against the weight. "It's hers, isn't it?" she growls, thrusting the tines forward, her voice rough with effort as the creature recoils, its mandibles snapping inches from her face. Jerry nods, frantic, and scrambles for a can of oil stacked by the feed bins, his hands shaking as he hurls it, the liquid splashing across the beast in a dark, glistening arc. "Light it!" he yells, his voice cracking, his eyes wide with terror and trust. Ellie snatches the lantern, smashing it against the spider's oil-slicked body, and flames roar to life, a searing wave that swallows the clicking, the screeching, the nightmare whole. The creature thrashes, its legs curling inward, and collapses in a charred heap, the stench of burnt hair and metal filling the air. She drops the pitchfork, her chest heaving, and staggers back, pulling Jerry with her as they collapse against Daisy, the horse trembling between them, her flank warm and solid. "Are you okay?" she rasps, wiping soot from his face with a shaking hand, her fingers smudging black across his cheek, her eyes searching his for cracks. He nods, breathless, his chest rising and falling fast, and clings to her arm, his grip tight, his voice a whisper against the fading crackle of the fire. "You didn't let it get me." "Never would," she says, her tone fierce but fraying, her hand lingering on his shoulder, steadying them both as the adrenaline ebbs. Daisy snorts, her ears flicking, and Ellie leans into her, feeling the horse's heartbeat through her coat, a rhythm that pulls her back from "Told you I've fought worse," she adds, her voice softening, her gaze drifting to the smoldering heap, its legs still twitching faintly. "Where'd it come from?" Jerry asks, his hands loosening but staying close, his eyes darting to the barn door, the dark beyond. She shakes her head, her jaw clenching, and mutters, "Sarah's lab, I'd bet. Same as that bite on you." She shifts, her leg throbbing as she straightens, and adds, "She's playing games we don't know the rules to yet." "She knew I'd run," he says, his voice small, his fingers tracing the edge of his jacket, and Ellie turns, her expression hardening, her hand tightening on his arm. "She doesn't know you're with me now," she says, her words a vow, her eyes fierce in the lantern's dying glow. "That changes everything." He nods, slow and shaky, and she pulls him closer, her arm wrapping around his shoulders, the soot smearing between them. "You did good with that oil," she says, her tone lifting slightly, a flicker of pride cutting through the exhaustion. "Quick thinking. Saved us a fight." "Learned from you," he murmurs, his head dipping, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and she chuckles, rough and low, the sound swallowed by the barn's quiet. "Guess I'm not a bad teacher," she says, ruffling his hair, her hand steady now, the trembling gone. "We can't stay here, can we?" he asks after a moment, his voice steadying, his eyes meeting hers, searching for the next step. She sighs, her gaze drifting to Daisy, then back to the charred remains, and says, "Not like this, no. But we're not running blind. I've got traps, I've got Rachel, and I've got you." "Enough," he presses, his tone tentative, his hands curling into fists, and she meets his stare, her voice firm, her resolve like iron. "More than enough. She's not ready for us." He exhales, a shaky breath, and leans into her, the tension easing from his frame, the barn's silence wrapping around them like a shield. "Get some air," she says, nudging him toward the door, her legs stiff as she rises, the shotgun still close. "I'll check Daisy." She's shaken but solid. He steps outside, the night cool against his skin, and she kneels by the horse, her hand running along her flank, whispering, "You held up, girl. Always do." Outside, the wind dies down, the clicking gone, and the forest watches, its shadows still and deep, holding its breath for what comes next. A stray cat prowls the porch, its tail flicking as dawn creeps over the horizon, painting the mist in shades of grey and gold. The farmhouse stands quiet, its windows barred with makeshift planks, a fortress carved from necessity. Ellie opens the door to Rachel Kane, her old friend's boots caked with mud, a thick file tucked under her arm, and she steps aside, her cane tapping the floor as Rachel brushes past, the scent of rain and coffee clinging to her coat. They settle at the kitchen table, now a war room of sorts, and Rachel spreads photos across the wood. Sarah in a lab coat, her smile cold and calculated. Strange creatures in cages, their limbs twisted and wrong. Bank records with Thomas's name scrawled in sharp ink. Ellie's eyes narrow, her fist clenching until her knuckles whiten, her breath sharp against the morning's chill. "She's been busy," Rachel says, her voice low and steady, her finger jabbing at a photo of Sarah, the lab's sterile glow behind her. "This isn't just a side gig. Those things you saw, they're hers, and she's got buyers lined up." Ellie leans forward, her silver hair brushing her cheek, and mutters, "Buyers for what?" "Monsters, tech," Rachel corrects, sliding the bank records closer, her tone hardening as she taps the numbers. "Bio-engineered weapons, near as I can tell. Thomas's money's all over it, funneled through shell companies." Ellie's jaw tightens, her gaze flicking to the stairs where Jerry lingers, half hidden, his sketchbook open to a drawing of the spider, its legs jagged and real, ink bleeding into the page. "You hear that, kid?" she calls, her voice firm but not harsh, inviting him down without pushing. He shuffles in, his sneakers scuffing the floor, and Rachel kneels beside him, her muddy knees creasing as she studies the sketch, her voice gentle against the room's tension. "You're braver than you know. Putting that on paper takes guts to face it twice." "Had to," Jerry mumbles, his fingers tracing the spider's outline, his eyes darting to Ellie, then back to the page. "She sent it, I know she did." Rachel nods, slow and sure, and says, "You're right, and we're closing in. Those cages match your story, every word." He exhales, a shaky breath, and Ellie watches, her chest tightening at the trust flickering in his gaze. "Thomas knew," she says, her tone icy, her hand reaching for the phone, the rotary dial cold under her fingers as she dials his number again. The line crackles and his voice comes through, clipped and flustered. "Mum, I told you. He's fine, we're fine, just busy down here." She grips the receiver tighter, her voice cutting through his stammer. "Busy funding Sarah's freaks." "I've got proof, Thomas. Bank records, photos, a damn spider that nearly took my barn apart." She's working on something big," he deflects, his words tripping over themselves, and Ellie hears Sarah's voice in the background, sharp, commanding, barking an order she can't make out. "Tell her to shut up," Ellie snaps, her patience fraying. "And tell me why your kid's got a bite mark and a tracker from her toys." The line cuts off, a dead click that echoes in the quiet, and she slams the receiver down, her fist trembling against the table. "He's lying," Jerry says, his voice small but steady, his sketchbook closing with a soft thud as he meets her gaze. Ellie nods, her expression dark, and mutters, "Always has, hid behind excuses since he was your age." She leans back, her cane tapping the floor, and adds, "But he's not hiding this. Not from me, not anymore." Rachel gathers the photos, her movements brisk, and says, "I've got contacts checking ports, shipments. Sarah's not just experimenting, she's selling this tech." Ellie's eyes flick to her, sharp and searching, and asks, "Who's buying?" Rachel shrugs, her jaw tightening, and replies, "Could be anyone. Private outfits, rogue states, but it's big and it's moving." "How long we got?" Ellie presses, her voice low, her mind ticking through traps and plans, her hands itching for action. Rachel meets her stare, her tone dropping to a whisper. "Not long. She's shipping soon. We've got to move fast, Ellie, or this gets out of our hands." Jerry shifts, his chair creaking, and asks, "What happens then?" Rachel glances at him, her expression softening, and says, "More like that spider, kid, more than we can burn." "Won't come to that," Ellie says, her voice firm, her fist unclenching as she rises, her legs stiff but steady. "We've got her number now. Rachel's digging, I'm holding here, and you're with me." Jerry nods, slow and resolute, and she adds, "Get some rest. You've earned it after last night." He heads upstairs, his steps heavy, and Ellie follows later, settling by his bed with the shotgun across her lap, her silver hair glinting in the lamplight as she watches him sleep fitfully, his sketchbook tucked close. "You're safe," she murmurs, her voice barely audible, her fingers brushing the gun's stock, her mind replaying Thomas's stammer, Sarah's bark, the spider's screech. She's scared too. Jerry mumbles, half asleep, his eyes fluttering open, and Ellie tilts her head, her brow furrowing as she leans closer. Scared of what? She asks, her tone gentle, probing the edges of his dream. He shifts, his voice fading, and says, Us, me and you. She exhales, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and whispers, Good, let her be. The night deepens, the farmhouse silent save for Jerry's uneven breathing, and Ellie sits guard, her resolve hardening, the photos and records burned into her mind, a net tightening around a truth she won't let slip. Outside, the mist thins, the forest still, and the cat curls up on the porch, its eyes glinting in the dark, watching. A flock of geese cuts through the sky, their honks fading into the wind as dusk settles over the farm, the air crisp with the promise of frost. The forest stands sentinel, its edges softening in the thinning mist. Ellie adjusts the laptop on the kitchen table, its screen casting a harsh glow across her weathered face, and she nods at Rachel, who punches in the satellite link, her fingers steady despite the tension crackling between them. The FBI agent's voice buzzes through, clipped and official, and Ellie slides the crushed tracker forward, its red light long dead, alongside Jerry's sketches and Rachel's file. The evidence, a silent indictment laid bare. This what you need? She asks, her tone rough but firm, her silver hair glinting as she leans into the frame. More than enough, the agent says, his voice tinny through the speakers, his eyes scanning the items as the screen flickers. We're moving now, stand by. The feed shifts, grainy and stuttering, and Sarah's face appears, her smile faltering, her lab coat stark against the Antarctic base's sterile walls. Thomas stands beside her, his shoulders slumped, his empire crumbling in real time as agents storm in, their shouts muffled but sharp, their boots echoing on the ice-cold floor. She's done, Rachel mutters, her hand resting on Ellie's arm, her gaze locked on the screen as Sarah's hands rise, her composure cracking. Ellie watches, her jaw tight, and says, About damn time. Thomas too? The agent's voice cuts back in, steady and final. Both of them? Collusion's clear, they're not slipping this. Ellie exhales, her fist unclenching, her eyes flicking to Jerry, who stands by the door, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, his frame still but taller somehow. You see that kid? She calls, her voice softening, her cane tapping the floor as she shifts toward him. He nods, slow and sure, and says, She looked scared. Didn't think she could be. Ellie chuckles, rough and low, and replies, Everyone's scared when the net pulls tight. Doesn't matter how cold they play it. What happens now? He asks, stepping closer, his sneakers quiet on the wood, his eyes clearer than she's seen them, bright against the fading light. Rachel shuts the laptop, her movements brisk, and says, They're locked up. FBI's got the lab, the buyers, the works. It's over, Jerry. Your drawings sealed it. He blinks, his lips parting, and murmurs, Didn't think they'd matter that much. Mattered more than you know, Ellie says, her tone firm, her hand resting on his shoulder, steady and warm. You held up, gave us what we needed. Proud of you for that. He ducks his head, a faint flush creeping up his neck, and she adds, Come on, let's breathe some air. Been cooped up too long. They step outside, the evening cool against their skin, and a bell jingles faintly from the woods, a soft chime that stops Ellie cold. Stay here, she says, grabbing the shotgun from the porch, her voice sharp as she moves toward the sound, her bad leg stiff but steady. Jerry follows anyway, his steps close, and she doesn't argue. Her grip tightening on the stock as they reach the farm's edge, the mist parting slightly under the last light. There, he whispers, pointing to a small, dying spider. Sarah's last weapon, its legs twitching weakly in the grass, a pitiful shadow of the beast they burned. Ellie kneels, her breath sharp, and crushes it under her boot, the crunch final, the mist curling away as if relieved. That's the end of it, she says, standing, her shoulders slumping with a weight lifting, her eyes meeting his, fierce but soft. Think so? He asks, his voice steady, his frame straight beside her as Daisy trots over, her grey mane swaying, her muzzle nudging his hand. Ellie nods, slow and resolute, and says, Yeah. She's got nothing left to throw. You're free now, kid, he exhales, a shaky breath, and leans into Daisy, the tension easing from his shoulders, the horse's warmth grounding him. The phone rings inside, shrill against the quiet, and Ellie limps back, her cane thudding the porch steps as Rachel answers, her voice lifting through the open door. "It's done," Rachel calls, stepping out, her boots still muddy, her tone light with relief. "They're both going down." "Thomas cracked, spilled everything, FBI's wrapping it up." Ellie nods, her shoulders slumping further, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she sinks onto the porch swing, the wood creaking under her. "Told you Rachel'd come through," she says, glancing at Jerry, her voice warm, her hand patting the seat beside her. He sits, Daisy grazing nearby, and asks, "What about Dad?" Ellie sighs, her gaze drifting to the forest, and says, "He made his bed, lost more than he'll ever get back, but you've got me, and that's not changing." "Enough?" he murmurs, his tone tentative, his fingers brushing Daisy's reins, and she meets his eyes, her voice steady, her resolve like roots running deep. "More than enough. Always was." He nods, slow and sure, and leans against her, the swing rocking gently, the night settling soft around them. "You hear that?" she asks after a moment, her head tilting, her ears catching the faint hum of helicopters in the distance, justice descending somewhere far off. He listens, his breath evening out, and says, "Yeah, sounds like it's really over." She chuckles, rough and warm, and replies, "It is, kid. Took a hell of a fight, but we got there." The mist fades, the forest quiet, and Daisy lifts her head, her whinny soft against the dusk, a note of peace threading through the air as the helicopters fade, their hum swallowed by the night. A blue jay flits between the trees, its wings flashing against the pale sky as the creek murmurs below, its waters catching the first glints of morning light. The farm stretches wide and open, the scars of battle fading into the earth's gentle embrace. Ellie leans against the porch rail, her cane resting beside her, its wood worn smooth by months of steadying her weight. And she watches Jerry by the barn, his thin frame bent over a bucket of apples, his laughter ringing out as Daisy nudges him playfully, her grey muzzle snuffling for more. The sound carries across the yard, bright and unburdened, and Ellie feels a rare smile tug at her lips, her silver hair lifting in the soft breeze, her chest loosening with a warmth she hasn't known in years. "Easy, girl," Jerry calls, his voice light, his hands offering another apple as Daisy chomps it down, her tail flicking with delight. He glances back, catching Ellie's eye, and jogs over, his sneakers kicking up dust, a sketchbook tucked under his arm, its edges curling from use. "Got something for you," he says, flipping it open, his fingers smudging charcoal as he reveals a portrait. Her and Daisy, strong and unyielding, her cane a quiet pillar beside the horse's steady bulk. "You've got an eye, kid," she says, her tone warm but firm, her hand ruffling his hair, gentle yet grounding, her gaze tracing the lines he's drawn. Her jaw set, Daisy's ears pricked, a moment caught in time. He ducks his head, a faint grin breaking through, and murmurs, "Took a while, wanted it right." She chuckles, rough and low, and replies, "Looks damn right to me, better than any photo I've got." "Come sit with me," he asks, his voice lifting, his eyes bright against the morning's glow, and she nods, grabbing her cane, her legs stiff but manageable as they head to the creek, the water gurgling over stones, its song soft and steady. They settle on the bank, the grass cool beneath them, and Ellie stretches out, her boots brushing the edge, her breath easing as the sunlight spills across the fields, warming their faces through the thinning mist. "Been thinking," Jerry says after a while, his hands pulling at a blade of grass, his tone slow and thoughtful, "about Sarah. Do you think she ever regretted it?" Ellie tilts her head, the breeze lifting her silver strands, and lets the question hang, her mind drifting to the grainy screen, Sarah's faltering smile, Thomas's broken stance. "Doesn't matter," she says finally, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his, fierce but soft. "You beat her, Jerry. That's what counts, not what's in her head." "Yeah?" he asks, his fingers pausing, his gaze searching hers, a flicker of doubt lingering beneath the calm. She nods, slow and sure, and says, "Yeah, she threw everything at you, and you're still here, feeding Daisy, drawing me like some war hero. That's winning, kid, plain and simple. He exhales, a quiet breath, and leans back, the grass crunching under him, his shoulders easing as the creek's murmur fills the silence. Miss him sometimes, he murmurs, his voice dropping, his eyes tracing the water's flow, and Ellie knows he means Thomas, the father who fell with Sarah. Locked away now in a cell she'll never see. Normal to miss him, she says, her tone gentle, her hand resting near his on the bank. He's still your dad. Doesn't erase the good bits, even if they're buried deep. Think he misses me? He asks, his voice tentative, his fingers twisting the grass, and Ellie sighs, her chest tightening as she weighs the truth against the hope he's reaching for. Hard to say, she admits, her gaze drifting to Daisy grazing nearby, the horse's quiet presence, a steady anchor. Lost himself a long time ago. Might be he's too far gone to feel it right, but you're worth missing, Jerry, whether he knows it or not. He nods, slow and thoughtful, and shifts closer, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact light but real. I'm glad I'm here, Grandma, he whispers, his voice barely above the creek's song, his eyes fixed on the water, bright with something new. Relief, maybe. Or peace. Ellie's throat tightens, her hand finding his, her grip firm and warm, and she says, Me too, kid. Wouldn't trade this for anything. Even the chopper days? He teases, a faint grin tugging at his lips, his tone lifting as he glances at her, and she laughs, rough and full, the sound rolling across the fields. Even those, she says, her eyes crinkling, her free hand gesturing to the sky. Flew high back then, but this, sitting here with you, Daisy chewing her way through my apples, this beats it all. Gonna draw more, he says, his voice steadying, his sketchbook resting beside him, a promise in its pages. Maybe the creek next. Looks different every day. She nods, her smile softening, and replies, Good. Keep seeing it. Keep putting it down. World needs that eye of yours. He grins wider now and leans against her, his way to quiet trust, the mist thinning as sunlight spills across them, warm and golden. Think Daisy's happy too? He asks, his tone light, his head tilting toward the horse, her whinny soft against the morning's hush. Ellie follows his gaze, her chest swelling, and says, Look at her, grazing like she owns the place, nudging you for treats. She's happy, all right. Got us both to spoil her now. The forest stands quiet at last, its shadows retreating, and they sit, the creek gurgling, Daisy's tail flicking, the world stretching wide and gentle around them. We did it, didn't we? He murmurs, his voice low, his eyes tracing the horizon, and Ellie squeezes his hand, her voice firm, her heart full. Damn right we did, together, every step. The sunlight deepens, the fog lifting, and they stay there, side by side, the farm alive with the promise of days unshadowed, the past fading like mist under a steady dawn. If this movie has touched your heart, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Join us in discovering more profound and meaningful stories. Don't keep the story to yourself. Share it with your friends to spread your emotions and connect souls. We also want to hear your own thoughts in the comments section. Each of your shares will be a bridge to build a close-knit community where we can find empathy together. The most fascinating stories are still waiting for you ahead. Follow me so you don't miss any moment. See you in the next video.